Down all the centuries during which turf was cut by hand with the slein, or by small machines in more recent decades, apart from these relatively small incursions around the margins of the bogs, the larger bogs were still vast, wild places where you could wander for miles without seeing any sign of the human presence. But in the second half of the 19th century and on into the 20th century, machines and techniques were developed which made the industrial exploitation of large bogs on an extensive scale possible. But here in Ireland, it was only with the establishment of Board na Mona in 1946 that large-scale exploitation of bogs by machine really got underway. During mechanical harvesting, large-scale milling machines remove the peat centimetre by centimetre across the entire surface of the bog once the surface vegetation has been removed and the bog drained sufficiently for the big machines to travel across it. Then, when the milled peat is dry, it was raked into long ridges that were transported by rail or tractor to make briquettes or for generating electricity. In the short space of 75 years, just my one lifetime, almost all of the great raised bogs were harvested of their economic reserves of peat, and the great mechanical leviathans that made it possible now stand abandoned in rusting graveyards. The coming of Board na Mona transformed the economy of the Irish Midlands. But there was a price to pay that was far higher than anything we could have anticipated when Board na Mona was set up in 1946. There was first of all the disappearance of the wild and wonderful places the raised bogs once were, and the extinction of the biodiversity that their disappearance represented. There were damaging impacts to air and water, and something that was scarcely at all recognised in the early decades, because there was almost no awareness of the problem of global warming, was the release into the atmosphere of the carbon dioxide that was stored in the peat, the immense reserve of carbon dioxide that was locked up in the bogs, and the contribution that that makes to one of the greatest problems that we humans have ever had to face. And this is why in 2019 the large-scale industrial exploitation of larger bogs, of bogs over 30 hectares, became illegal. And we're now faced with the challenge not only of finding substitutes for peat, but of regaining that lost biodiversity and restoring to the stripped bogs their lost function of carbon sequestration. Today, only the smallest handful of relatively intact, larger raised bogs remain. And the best of these are carefully protected under the umbrella of the government's Living Bog project. But there's a large number of precious smaller bogs, such as this wonderful example near Coolderry. These are the face banks which mark the limit of incursion by hand cutting, and the pools mark the deep pits from which the turf was cut and saved by hand. And they are being recolonised, as you can see, by a succession of sphagnum species and other plants, and a large number of small animals which make it a miniature jungle of biodiversity. Over behind me is the area of Old Turberry, where the freshly cut sods were wheeled out and spread to dry. And behind that is an area of still older Turberry, which has been recolonised by trees, and it is a wooded ecological complex of extraordinary vitality. And you can see the way the Scots pines, which are self-seeded and of local provenance, Scots pines have migrated onto the younger Turberry and onto the bog itself. These fringing woods on the earlier workings on the margins of the bogs have developed a new and evolving ecological equilibrium of their own accord since their abandonment no more than 2 or 3 generations ago. These areas, where the natural processes of recolonisation have been active longest, are of particular importance because they provide a glimpse of the possibilities for the spontaneous return of a high level of biodiversity in equilibrium with the changing conditions. Many of the older pines in these woods are wonderful stately trees of great individual presence and local provenance, the descendants of trees that may have been here for countless generations. In certain areas of Old Turbury, hydrological conditions are sometimes more widely suited to sphagnum regeneration, and in the medium to long term these may extend onto the main area of the bog, wherever conditions are favourable to its re-establishment. When you look at a bog that has recently been stripped of its peat on a large scale, it's easy to think that all has been lost from an ecological point of view. But where the hydrology is favourable, if the drains are blocked and the surface is re-wetted, it may be possible to encourage the regrowth of the sphagnum that is so essential to restoration of the bog. But if that living layer of sphagnum at the surface has been lost, this is often very difficult to achieve in practice. But even though it may not be possible to restore actively growing bog to these vast areas of industrial cutaway, these are areas of great ecological resilience. As soon as the machines withdraw, plants begin to invade, to colonise the bare peat surface, and in time an ecological mosaic of great biological diversity begins to develop. This will be mainly woodland, but interspersed with smaller areas of marsh, fen and bog where conditions are wetter. Richly biodiverse, areas to be cared for and preserved for this reason and because of what they can contribute to the experience of people who will visit them in the decades and centuries to come. The preservation and management of this new wild habitat mosaic is one of the great positive opportunities we now have to recover much of the biodiversity and carbon sequestration function of the raised bogs of long ago. In a future world where global warming and the loss of biodiversity will be among the greatest challenges we face.